Hello and welcome to Microsoft Hates Greg. My name is Greg Deckler, and today we're going to be exploring the question on whether data marts are in Power BI are dead. Um, so why are we asking this question, right? So we're asking this question primarily because of the introduction of Fabric, right? And here I am in my Fabric-enabled workspace, and I got my Fabric trial going here. And just to be clear, right? I mean, I was part of the private preview for what was called Trident at the time. And so I've had months and months to take a look at this stuff because and form opinions about this. So, but if we go into create a new content and say show all, right? We have all these new workloads like data engineering, like lakehouse and notebooks and Spark jobs and that. But we have, it's primarily, in particular lakehouse. We also have this new data warehouse, right? In addition to all of our, existing Power BI stuff that we can create. And again, if I had PPU enabled, if this was premium capacity or PPU, I could create a data mart here as well. And then I have this real-time analytics, again, all this new stuff, right? So, and this is all that stuff that Fabric, adds to the stuff you can create within a workspace. Okay. So before we get into like whether data marts are dead and do we need them, right? Because a warehouse, my lake house, do we need what essentially is a data mart? It's kind of like a baby data warehouse, more or less, right? So is it redundant and is it going to be deprecated anytime soon, right? So before we get to the answer, my opinion on that, and my evidence for why I don't think that data marts are or not going away, I feel it would be remiss if I didn't address kind of an ad hoc off the cuff, comment that I made in my last video that sort of elicited I'll call it an undue level of negative reaction. Let's call it that. Let's call it that. Where basically I referred to Fabric as a nothing burger. Okay. So I don't know how well a nothing burger translates outside of the United States. So what is a nothing burger? So a nothing burger, I believe it originated in like the political context of the United States, where essentially something is hyped up as some big revelation or some kind of big news coming out of the political realm. But when it's announced or actually revealed, and people boil it down to its brass tacks, it really amounts to nothing. It's a non-story essentially. So that's what a nothing burger is. So why do I feel that Fabric is a nothing burger? Well, first, in my experience, generally when you give your kind of honest, off the cuff, ad hoc, just opinion on something, and it elicits an undue negative reaction, you've probably hit the nail pretty much on the head. That's in my experience. And second, again, I was part of the private preview for what was called Trident at the time, so I've had a long time to form an opinion on this. We're talking months and months, right? That this stuff was in private preview, and it was finally released under the brand of Fabric, right? Um, and my opinion on this essentially is that Fabric is nothing more than a licensing bundle and a brand, and maybe you could say it's a UI slapped on it. That's all it is, and that to me is not particularly noteworthy, because it's like it doesn't enable anything that I couldn't do before. So who cares? That's my opinion on why I think it is that. And so for evidence of that, right? If you take a look at the community site for Fabric, right, you have you don't even have a Fabric forum, right? There's no new thing, right? It's just Power BI, Synapse, and Data Factory just bundled together, right? So Trident, right, other than being a pack of gum, a gum brand, is also a three-pronged spear. What are the three prongs? Oh, Power BI, Synapse, and Data Factory. Well, there you go. Probably why it was called Trident to begin with. Um, so back to workloads, right? So if we take a look at these workloads more closely, we realize they're just all existing things that we could do before. These are Azure Synapse workloads, Azure Synapse Analytics workloads, Azure Data Factory workloads, Azure Synapse workloads again, Azure Synapse workload, Azure Synapse Analytics workloads, right? I mean, it's all stuff that existed before. It's just all been bundled now under a license SKU, and the UI that's been slapped on top of it. In fact, like this under this data science, if you click on this learn more link, it machine learning capabilities in Azure Synapse Analytics. They didn't even bother to rebrand it as Fabric, right? So it's just the same stuff that you can do before, and now it's just here, right? I mean, that's all it is, in my opinion. They didn't even bother to rebrand it, and at least certain parts of it. They haven't gotten around to it, I guess. So, I mean, in my opinion, this could have easily, instead of adding all this confusion about this new thing, Fabric and paradigm shift and blah blah blah. I mean, in theory, right? They could have added this. If we go back to workspace, my workspace here, right? They could add these as workspace settings, right? Similar to how I have this Azure connections here, Azure Data Lake Gen 2 storage. I can point it to my own instance of Azure Data Lake Gen 2 and use that, as part of this workspace, right? They could have added an Azure Synapse, you know, link here. I can just take my Azure Synapse, environment that I already have and associate it with this workspace. Same thing with Azure Data Factory, right? And then that could have enabled, these new workloads that I can create within the workspace when I go here, right? So they could have implemented it that way. I think it's a better, easier way to think about it. It reduces a lot of the confusion around what people are feeling around, what Fabric is and what Fabric isn't. But maybe in fact, maybe that would have been a better way of doing it, right? Because I don't know how this all works underneath the hood necessarily, but let's say that this Azure, when I create up a Fabric instance and is when I create a data lakehouse or some other Azure Synapse content, is that spinning up a separate instance of Azure Synapse for each workspace that I've created, right? But what if, or is it one single Azure Synapse instance, for all the workspaces within the tenant? But regardless of which one it is, right? What if I want the opposite? What if, let's say that each one of these workspaces, when I create Azure Synapse content, spins up basically a new instance of Azure Synapse just for that workspace? What if I don't want that? What if I want to consolidate all those workloads under a single Azure Synapse, instance that I have created for all of my Azure Synapse workloads? I can't do that, right? I don't have that option. Or the reverse, these are all going to a single Azure Synapse instance, all my workload, all my workspaces, right? But really, I want two separate ones. I want one for my finance workloads, and I want a different one for my operational workloads, right? It kind of reduces the flexibility around all this sort of stuff versus if they'd just kind of implemented as workspace settings, similar to what they did with Azure Data Lake Gen 2, right? If I want to implement an instance per workspace, I can do that. I have that flexibility. If I want it to all point to a single Azure Data Lake, instance, then I can do that. I have that flexibility. So better maybe if they'd have done it that way versus just kind of bundling it all together, right? What if I don't want Azure Data Factory? I just want Azure Synapse and those workloads, then I'm paying for stuff that I'm not using or I don't need in terms of, the Data Factory stuff, or if I just want the Data Factory, not the Azure Synapse, So better maybe, I don't know. Anyway, back to this question of whether or not Power BI data marts are dead, or are they not going to be dead? Are they going to be deprecated or not? And now my personal opinion on this is that they are going to be around for a good long time. And the reason I believe that is I think they really serve two very different purposes. Like you have very different purposes between an Azure data, a Synapse data warehouse versus a data lake house or lake house or a data mart, right? And in fact, Microsoft has this handy decision guide for Microsoft Fabric Decision Guide, Data Warehouse, or Lakehouse. But they went through the trouble of including Power BI Data Mart in here as well, right? So and there's a bunch of different differences between them, types of data, primary develop. Really the one that I think is the primary is this primary developer persona, right? The data warehouse, the Synapse data warehouse, really is designed for like your professional data modeler, SQL engineer, et cetera, right? And same thing with like Lakehouse is like your professional data engineer and data scientist. Whereas I think the data mart really serves the persona of like your citizen developer, right? Because anybody that is a user that you enable, within a premium capacity or PPU, right? They can spin up a data mart in a very low code, right? No code type of way. And I demonstrated this a few videos back where I kind of explored the data marts and things like that. So, the other argument around this is that, okay, this whole Trident preview, whatever they, in these Azure Synapse workloads have existed for a good long time, right? Lakehouse has been around forever, data warehouse, and all of that sort of thing. But they still, Microsoft still went out of their way to create a Power BI data mart, even though these things basically already existed or were in development. They still came out with Power BI Data Mart. So Microsoft, I think, must obviously feel that they serve different uses and different use cases. Okay. And the final reason I would say that data marts are going to be around for a while is the PPU licensing structure, right? The premium per user licensing structure, which enables you to create Power BI data marts, but not a lakehouse or a data warehouse, right? Without the Fabric license, the way they've got it all bundled together. So if they would deprecate Power BI data marts, right, they'd be taking away a really significant amount of functionality and a feature set away from those PPU users, which, I don't think, that would go over all that well. So that's really, there's a long way to get around to, whether or not Power BI data marts are going to be dead or not. I think they're going to be around for a good long time. That's really all for this video. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.